On December 19th, 2017, Dr. Jill Derby, the chairwoman of the American University of Iraq in Kurdistan, spoke to the National Security Forum of Northern Nevada on the dilemma of the Kurdish people across 4 nations. This audio picks up as Dr. Ty Cobb, the founder of the National Security Forum, introduces Dr. Derby.
Our good fortune is to have an incredible speaker to meet with us today, and that's Dr. Jill Derby. I think a lot of you recognize the name Derby. It's old Nevada. She was born in Lovelock and grew up in that area. And if you drive out on the Truckee River, you'll be familiar with the Derby Dam that was named after her family. Here in this country, Jill has done so many things. She's been a regent, and in fact, she chaired the Board of Regents in the Nevada System of Higher Education. More importantly, she's worked a lot in Kurdistan, and she is on the board of the American University in Kurdistan and spends a lot of time there. We're very fortunate to welcome to the National Security Forum, Dr. Jill Derby.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good enough. Well, let me tell you that we're going to cover a lot of material in short order, because to understand the Kurds in the Middle East and the Iraqi autonomous area that is designated for the Kurds, you really have to get the sweep of history. And in order to do that, I'm going to cover a lot of history in short order. And if I talk a little fast, stay with me, buckle up. We're just going to cover a lot of it, because as is always the case in the Middle East or any place else in the world, you've got to have an understanding of the historical context, the geographical context that underlies an area. So let's start talking about the Kurds, a promised land, unpromised is my title. I'm associated with the American University of Iraq in Sulaymaniyah, and I just wanted to show you a picture of it. We're very proud of our campus, and one of the great delights for me when I visit is what you see on the soccer team is the Kurds and the Arabs and the Sunni and the Shia and the Yazidis and the Turkmen and the Assyrian Christians all playing soccer together, and they could care less about religious and political differences. And that's really why I believe in higher education. The hope of the world is really through educating our youth to understand people are people everywhere, whatever their political and religious differences, and sometimes leaders use those differences to gin up and advance their own agenda. But you get these kids together and hey, they don't care, they're out to win a soccer game. So let me start by just pointing to the where Iraq is in the Middle East, and you can see the neighborhood there. That with it's a tough neighborhood. It borders Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And the story of the Kurds in that area relates a lot to who's in that neighborhood. So let me show you just a map of Iraq, and you see that where Baghdad is. If you look up here, and I apologize to not be able to point for the other projection screens in the room, I can do it here. But if you look up in the far right, you see Sulaymaniyah. That's where the American University of Iraq, where I am currently actually chairing the Board of Trustees. You see where Mosul is, way near the top. We'll be talking about Mosul. Erbil there, right below Mosul, is the capital of the Kurdish region of Iraq, which is a semi-autonomous region in Iraq. You see where Kirkuk is, which is currently very much in the news. So keep that map in your mind as we talk about the area. If you look at Iraq, this is very generalized, but you see that Iraq is really a multi-religious country. I'll talk about how that happened and how it got started, but you see mostly the Shia in the south, next to Iran, where there are very strong ties across that border, the Sunni here in the middle, and the Kurds up there in the north. This shows those Sunni Shia areas a little bit better. The dark brown is the semi-autonomous Kurdish region of Iraq. And you can see how the rest of the country is divided up with some very mixed areas of Sunni and Shia, Sunni and Kurds, but down in the south here and the southeast is the part that abuts Iran, where there are very close ties. I want you to look at this because this is a lot in the news these days. What recently happened between the Iraqi central government in Baghdad and the Kurds, the KRG is called the Kurdish Regional Government, has for decades now disputed this territory that's in the brown. In other words, the green is clearly the boundaries of the autonomous region that is the Kurds within the federation that is Iraq. The brown is disputed territory, like they don't agree. The Kurds say, listen, Kirkuk is traditionally ours. There are a lot of Kurds there. They're not actually the majority. But, and because there's a lot of oil around Kirkuk, it is part of the disputed territories between the Iraqi central government and the Kurds in the north. What happened, and I'll say this briefly as we get to, I'm going to cover a lot of history and then I want to get to what's happening now because that's really the most interesting, but you got to know the history of the place to understand it. But you'll see that what happened when ISIS came in and captured so much Iraqi territory, the Iraqi army retreated, the Kurds grabbed Kirkuk and said, now it's ours. There's a lot of oil around Kirkuk, and that didn't set well with the Baghdad central government, but they were trying to fight a war with ISIS, and they couldn't take on the Kurds, who were really aligned with them in fighting this war with ISIS. But let's go back. I'm going to do Islam 101 in 5 minutes. So the Prophet Muhammad lived in the 7th century. He died without any successor. He had established the religion of Islam, very, very large community of Muslims. But what happened, with no successor designated, there was an argument among the followers in the community, and one group went with the Prophet's son-in-law, and another group went with his close companion. And as a result of that, there was a split, then there was a fight about it. Some main figures, like the Prophet's grandson Hussein was killed, became a martyr. It's one of the biggest shrines in southern Iran, in southern Iraq, and it really connects Iran and Iraq, as you'll see later, in a very close way because of that religious connection. But anyway, what happened was interesting because most Muslims in the world are Sunni Muslims. So after this split, the only place where Shia Islam took off was right up there in what's called the Shia Crescent. But just to go back here, I'd like to put this in to remind you that the three Abrahamic religions are indeed Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they trace their origins and their heritage to the patriarch Abraham, who had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is one of the great Jewish prophets, and also, you know, Christianity emerged from Judaism and the Old Testament. On the other side was Ishmael the son, and out of Ishmael, the heritage, the lineage, comes Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and all that follows. So these are what the Arabs call Ahlul Kitab. That means people of the book. And all three of these religions honor the Old Testament. And the truth is, through all those centuries, particularly during the huge Islamic empire, and when the Muslim conquered other lands, they were always very tolerant of the Jews and the Christians because they were people of the book. So they were allowed to continue while the Muslims took dominance over the countries and the politics and the treasury, but they allowed these other two groups to practice their religion because they're people of the book. That, by the way, continues today. That's not true of ISIS, an extremist branch of Islam. Anyway, the Shia Crescent, that has influence today. This is where all the Shia of the world reside. Probably 15% of Muslims are Shia, maybe 85% and more are Sunni Muslims. Now, where the Kurds live. You can see where the Kurds live in the yellow, and it's divided between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. They've lived there for a very long time. Who are they? They're largely Sunni Muslims, not entirely, some Shia, some Assyrian Christians, some Yazidis, some Zoroastrianism. They live in the mountainous areas up there. They have for centuries. They were always pastoralists, but once the national lines were drawn by the British and France after World War I, they couldn't cross those boundaries anymore, so they settled down, mostly farming. But they've been around for a very long time. They're one of the biggest ethnic groups in the Middle East. Now, to understand that whole part of the world, we got to go back to World War I and what happened. So you had the British and the French and the Russians on one side in World War I. You had Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire on the other side, and then there was the Ottoman Empire, which had been in place for 5 or 6 centuries, but it was very weakened. And the leaders went to the French and the British and said, we'd like to ally with you. They saw they were going to have to align with somebody, and neither the British nor the French wanted them because they were very weak. They were really going broke in the Ottoman Empire. Here's the Ottoman Empire. Can you see? It was very extensive. And as I say, it had been in existence for probably 5 or 6 centuries. Anyway, so what happened following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire? Let's go back. The British and French sat down and said, okay, let's divide up this territory. We won. The Germans and their allies, who were also the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. So now this is all ours. So they sat down at the table and they just started drawing lines. Now, they didn't consult with anybody inside those lines, but they realized there were oil and resources to be had. So between the British and the French, this is how they divided it up. So the French got Lebanon and Syria. The British got Palestine, Jordan, Transjordan then, and Iraq, but there was no Iraq. So what they did was to draw these lines and say, we're going to call this Iraq. They didn't consult with anybody there, and it's been a problem ever since. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place. So what happened to make it all worse is the British said, now that we own this new country we call Iraq, and we've drawn these lines, and everything that's in it, we're going to appoint our old friend, Faisal, who had fought us alongside, you remember Lawrence of Arabia, Colonel Lawrence, who helped align with the Arab tribes to throw the Turks out in the whole area that is Palestine and Syria today. If any of you saw that movie, it's a great movie. But anyway, so there was alignment there, and the British were very, very grateful to the Arabs who had helped them defeat the Turks and help them win that whole area that is Palestine and Syria, now Lebanon. So they decided to make their old friend Faisal, who was a prince of Mecca and who had fought alongside the British, make him king of Iraq. Well, that started all the problems because he was a Hashemite, as, by the way, the kings of Jordan have continually been and are now. King Hussein was a Hashemite, and his son, now the ruler, is a Hashemite. It's an old ancient tribe in the Mecca region. But anyway, so they made him king. Well, nobody thought much of it there. The Kurds, the Shia, because you see, the Hashemites are Sunnis. And this area, Iraq, was clearly from the beginning a predominantly Shia area and with close ties to Iran. So what happened then was, there's a lot of, I'm just going to walk you through this really carefully. Everybody fought. The Kurds started rebelling against the British presence there. So did the Shia, so did the Sunni, everybody did. This king was imposed. He'd never known anything about that part. But, you know, the British were very strong. They had a big army. They maintained their presence there clear, really, through World War I. When the Iraqis fought, they thought the British are paying attention to other countries. Let's see. But they were also promised a homeland after World War II. What I forgot to tell you is in the settlement after World War I, what happened was the British promised the Kurds at that time a homeland. That was before Turkey fought a war of national liberation and became its own country and said, we're not going for that. But the British at that point and the French had promised the Kurds that they could have a homeland after World War I. World War II, after World War II, it was again promised and again reneged on. In the meantime, a guy named Mustafa Barzani had really organized the Kurds in what he called the Kurdish Democratic Party. It's one of the main parties in Iran today. And he organized a very military group. They were warriors. They were used to living up in those hills in northern Iraq. They had fought foreign domination for years, with all the empires that had come and gone and conquered them. So they were just really always been very good warriors. Finally, in 1958, Iraq throws out the British. It becomes a secular state with military rule. And the Kurds fight with this group for their own independence up in the north. What happened in 1970 was the Iraqi army and the central government was tired of fighting with the Kurds and said, why don't you just go up there and stay out of our hair, and we won't bother you much. It was still going to be part of Iraq, but let's just stop fighting. It was just got too costly, 100,000 killed and so on and so forth. Then somewhere around that time, Jalal Talabani, who's tired of just one Kurdish party under the Barzanis, really a tribal name and so forth, starts the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. So now we have two Kurdish parties that are up in that part of northern Iraq. Then 1979 is when Saddam Hussein came to power. There had been military coups along the way, but the military had been running Iraq for some time. Then you remember this, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Shah, who we had helped impose, was thrown out. And what came in instead, of course, were the clerics, were the Shia religious leaders, and took over the government. And I have to tell you, just by way of passing, that in Iraq, the Shia leaders don't believe that Shia leaders ought to be running a government. They think they ought to be moral counselors to people. It's a real difference between Iraq and Iran in terms of their regard for the clerics. But anyway, you remember this. And then what happened is Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis were really worried because so much of southern Iraq is holy ground for the Shia and the Iranians. So they started an 8-year war that was bloody. We supported Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis. We were furious with the Iranians for taking our embassy and taking the people hostage for a year. Those of you that were following the news around that time remember that went on for a whole year where they held our embassy personnel hostage. We therefore armed Saddam Hussein in Iraq, lots and lots of arms to defeat Iran. Well, what happened was it was a stalemate. Probably 1 million people were killed. It was a bloody, awful war. But in the end, the UN brokered a truce, and that was that. But in the meantime, the Kurds in the north had supported Iran. And that's a complicated story, but which I'm not going to go into, but Saddam Hussein was furious. He said, that's it for the Kurds. We're going to just get them out of here with a kind of final solution. Took his army that, mind you, we had helped build up with all our military support during the Iran-Iraq War, and went after the Kurds, wiped out thousands of villages. They fled up into the mountains and all around the region and up to England, all sorts of other places. There was quite a Kurdish diaspora at that time. Then you'll remember, I'm skipping this history, but then Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. We push him out of Kuwait. We tell the Kurds and we tell the Shia down in the south, rise up against him. He's weakened now. We've weakened him militarily, but we never went to their aid in doing that. So they ended up paying a terrible price in Iraq, those that tried to rebel and throw out Saddam Hussein. We felt a little guilty about it. What we ended up doing in 1991, 1992, is forming this on the 36th parallel. We imposed a no-fly zone. We said to Saddam Hussein, you can't go north of this. We said to the Kurds, come back home and come back to this land and prosper. And they did. And the story of how the Kurds returned, and with this protection, absolute security and stability in this whole north of the country, they just prospered. And if you were to go to Kurdistan today, although today it's a tougher place because of what just happened, but you would find a prosperous place with skyscrapers, lots of commerce and business and international presence, and lots of good things happening. As a result of this, we've always sort of seen the autonomous region of Kurdistan, which is part of the federation that is Iraq, as our creation and ally in a way. I mean, we really went to bat for them, we protected them, but then what did the Kurds do? But anyway, In 92, let me just be clear, that's when the Kurdish regional government was established. They had elections. The two parties, the KDP, which is Barzani, and the PUK, which was Talabani, really came very close. So they just set up a government, an elected government and a parliament. Well, that didn't last too long, because by 1994, these are the two figures that headed the two parties. They started fighting. They had a civil war. It was bloody. It went on for almost 4 years. We finally got into it and said, look, we're not going to protect you with our no-fly zone if you're going to be fighting with each other. So you either resolve this thing or we're out of it. And we had been giving a lot of aid to Kurdistan and supporting business interests and investment and so on and so forth. So we had a lot to say about it. We finally got them to lay down their guns and agree to work together. But the way they agreed to work together has not led to cohesion. So what they decided to do, and you see in the map over there, was that they would have a ministry of the interior, and there would be a head minister from the KDP and a head minister from the PUK. So they sort of divided it up. It would be like, we have the Department of Defense, and then we have, two secretaries, one from each party. So, I want you to understand why this disunity within the Kurds of Iraq, I'm talking about them now, and it's true in some other places too, but how that has continued to be a very major factor and is in fact today. So let me keep going. Because just to tell you what happened over there to the Turkish Kurds, because if you remember the graphic I showed, the majority of the Kurds actually live in southeastern Turkey. So, and although the Kurds are spread in the areas also in Syria and Iran and Iraq, but the majority of them, maybe 65, 70% of them, Turkey. But what happened with Turkey after World War II is quite different, because Turkey ended up fighting a war for national liberation following the First World War and was able to throw out the British and the French and to establish itself as an independent Republic of Turkey. So in the 1920 treaty that followed World War I was when the Kurds were promised a homeland. When Turkey then fought this war and they got their own independence and were recognized by all the nations, and the then League of Nations, they said, no way is there going to be a separate Turkish homeland. No, these are our boundaries. We're going to assimilate these Kurds, and we're all going to be Turks. And so as a result of that, they sought to suppress the Turkish language, the Kurdish language and culture, and try to assimilate. And the Kurds weren't having anything to do with it. And so from the very beginning, they really resisted that. But Mustafa Kemal was the one that led the effort to fight off the British and French and create the independent republic. He was a great leader, really, formed a secular, progressive nation with more women's rights, thank you, than any of the European or the US had, a very progressive place. And then they joined NATO in 1951. So that's a story of the Turkish Kurds. But the Turkish Kurds were never happy about it. See, there's a big block over there, and you see how that also abuts Iraq. So they, from the very beginning, said, no, we want our own space. And all the more so when their brothers, the Kurds over in Iraq, got their own separate space. They felt like they should have it. So they, from the very beginning, were always restive and rebellious and not going along with the program in terms of we're all going to be Turks, and the Turkification of the Kurds. It just didn't go down well. So anyway, back one here. Then in 1978, a new development happened. This guy named Öcalan formed a group called the PKK. You hear about the PKK today. What he and his group said, they were not all the Kurds in Turkey, but it was a militia that he put together in Turkey that said, we've protested and we've argued, and now we're just going to pick up our guns. And they adopted violence as a legitimate tactic to gain their own independent status within Turkey. And it was violent and it was nasty, and over a period of the next few decades, probably 40,000 people died in that. So they killed, Turkish military, Turkish police, Turkish civilians with terrorist acts, and the Turkish army opposing them killed a lot of the Kurds. And you know how in all of these situations, it's the civilians that suffer. This went on for a long time. Öcalan continued to be their leader and a powerful figure, and finally the Turks found him and arrested him down in Africa. And because he'd been on the lam for a long time, they knew he was the big leader and just really adored by the Turkish Kurds. Anyway, they put him in prison. They were going to execute him. The European Union said, if you want to ever join us, we don't go for capital punishment, don't execute him. So they said, okay, because they've always wanted to join the European Union. You know, where Turkey sits, they're kind of half and half. And if you visit Istanbul or any of those wonderful Turkish cities, you feel that. You know, it's sort of the bridge between Asia and Europe, and very westernized in so many ways, and so on and so forth. And they've always wanted to join the European Union. So they said, okay, we won't. But they put him on a little island out in the Mediterranean in a prison all by himself. And he's still there, but he's still the leader of the PKK. Now, the story is a sad one, because what happened is when Erdogan came to power, he said, let's put away this fight with the Kurds. And he and Öcalan sat down, essentially, and agreed to a peace that lasted for several years. And the PKK renounced violence. And then, you know, as it happens, a year ago, there was an incident. And some of the people, the fighters who were part of the PKK, shot some Turkish police, and then it's all over. So they're battling again, and that's why the Turkish government is scared of the Syrian Kurds. This PKK group has its affiliate down among Syrian Kurds who have been fighting ISIS. So you see the crisscrossing of alliances here that happens. Let me keep going quickly here. Okay, 2003, we invade Iraq. The Kurds support us. They just anything to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They thought it was great. They didn't oppose our, you know, they just thought it was fine that we were invading Iraq. Toppling Saddam Hussein dramatically affected the regional power balance. Not sure people were looking ahead to see what would happen, but you see, he was Sunni and he was secular. And by bringing in then the Shia government that came in, they were the majority, they had an election, there's a 2005 constitution, we helped them draw it up. The Shia were the majority, clearly always have been in Iraq, and they then took on the government. A guy named Maliki, who then promised to unify the country with the Sunni and the Kurds and everything, did nothing but disunify the country, and he fired, and that has continued. We made the enormous mistake of dismissing all the Sunni Baathists. Baathist was Saddam Hussein's party. It's a big political party like Democrats, Republicans, and if you came in and fired all the Republicans in the government or all the Democrats in the government, you wouldn't have a lot left. So that was a very strategic mistake we made. As a result of that, what happened was all these people that had been civil servants at all sorts of levels, leaders in the army, were all fired. They had no place to go. They had no paychecks. And that was the beginning of Al-Qaeda, because if you marginalize the people and make them poor and hungry, they'll find some way to resist. That's where Al-Qaeda started, and Sunnis became a persecuted minority in Iraq. I just want to interrupt to say you got to understand how important the Shia shrines in Iraq are. Because before there was an Iraq, there was just one big country, right? And this is part of the Shia crescent. And their most sacred shrines happen to be over in southern Iraq, not in Iran, which is a 90% Shia nation. And so there's a natural sort of alliance there that happens. And once we took out the Sunni government and the Shia came in, then Iran has been very much involved and influential, and that's a story that continues. But just to help understand that, one of the shrines in Kabbalah, which is where the grandson Hussein was martyred, has a bigger pilgrimage every year than the Hajj of Mecca. Like 20 million people come and you walk, because you don't drive up when you're doing a pilgrimage, you know. Anyway, 20 million people on the average, that's more than pilgrimage to Mecca. So I want you to get a sense of southern Iraq and the important symbolic power that the Shia have there. And I should tell you that not only do they have symbolic power, but if you see down here, those shrines are very, very powerful and wealthy. They're rich institutions, imagine with 20 million people coming. And they have assumed in many cases the function of a state. They're very wealthy, and they have their own militias. So now we go to recent history. Sorry for all the text, but just to cover it quickly. So then what happened is that the Kurds are operating in their semi-autonomous region with their own parliament and with their two political parties still fighting, and running their own affairs. They decide to work with Turkey, and Turkey, who needs the oil, says works for us. So then Turkey and Iraqi Kurdistan clinch a pipeline deal. It made Baghdad furious because the 2005 constitution said, no, all oil dealings and revenue goes through Baghdad, and then we'll give you, the Kurds, 17% of the oil revenue. And that was the deal. It's in the Constitution. So the Kurds doing this separate deal with Turkey, and Turkey did it because they needed the oil, apologizing to Baghdad. Anyway, I'm just trying to give you the history of some of the conflict over there. Okay, what happens in 2014? You remember this. ISIS, then, which had ballooned, suddenly comes in and grabs a huge chunk of Iraqi territory. Mosul, the second biggest city, almost 2 million. They captured Mosul. It's way up there in the north. Not a Shia city, by the way. Few Shia there, mostly Sunni, Turkmen, Kurds. It's a multi-ethnic city. Anyway, they took it. And then the Kurdish Peshmerga got into the fight because at one point ISIS headed towards Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdish region, and then the Kurds got into the fight. We got into the fight to protect the Kurds. We're very protective of the Kurds. We sort of set that whole place up, and they've been our strong allies always for a very, very long time. But what happened when the Iraqi army retreated, a lot of reasons for that. Maliki had really just, after firing all the Baathists, who were some of the best military strategists, he just, in a way of patronizing the institution, put all his best friends and lead the military. I mean, it was a wreck, the Iraqi army. They retreated. The Kurdish saw their opportunity and went and took Kirkuk. Remember, that was a disputed territory. You see this disputed territory right there? They just marched in and took a big chunk of the disputed territory and said, aha, now it's ours. Anyway, that didn't go over well in Baghdad, but Baghdad had bigger fish to fry. They had to fight ISIS, who had taken probably more than a quarter of their country. Then the Iranian president vowed to protect the Shia holy sites in Iraq. But the other thing that happened that bears force today is the popular mobilization forces. So the Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, a big figure in Iraq, a big cleric, or Iraqi cleric, who's a Shia, put out a call, a fatwa, a sectarian fatwa, not a religious one, that said, every Iraqi male citizen, grab your guns, we got to get these guys out. They've invaded our country, they conquered a big swath of it, and so it was a call to arms for all Iraqi citizens. Well, there were already a lot of militias over there, and a number of them with very, very close ties to Iran. But so then what happened, this popular mobilization forces end up gaining a lot of influence, playing a big role in winning the war. The Iraqi military trained them, those that didn't know how to fight, and but they were always really separate, with a lot of them directly reporting to Iran. So you can get the complicated picture. Then what happens is that, well, you see that the Syrian and Iraqi Kurds get into this fight right away, protecting their own, and also seeing an opportunity. The Syrian Kurds, who've really were so what do I want to say, never had near the aspirations for autonomy of the Iraqi Kurds, never had any support for that. The Assad regime had always marginalized them, in fact, tried to Arabize them, and but with all of this going on, the Syrian civil war, they saw the opportunity, so they got into the fight, and their closest ties are with the PKK, which we designated as a terrorist organization. So did Europe, so has Turkey. You see the alliances across those borders, so that's why the Turkish president gets pretty upset, because what's going on in Syria is really supported by the PKK, the terrorist organization in Turkey that's trying to take him down. So you get how complicated this gets. Anyway, the Iraqi Kurds fight aligned with the U.S. Were very, influential in the victory. They're great fighters. Okay, you saw the disputed territory. Then what happens is that Barzani decides, because there's so much goodwill towards the Kurds and the valiant way they fought against ISIS, and we're all aligned against ISIS, and they were great allies and great soldiers. They lost some thousands in the fight against ISIS. And so as Mosul is retaken in the summer of 2015, and Barzani decides, now our time, we're going to have a referendum up here for the independence of Kurdistan. And he thinks that everybody who's sympathetic worldwide with the Kurds and appreciating their heroic efforts against ISIS in alliance with us and everybody else will back them on this. Nobody backed them. It was just like, no, don't do that. Don't destabilize things. We still haven't quite pushed ISIS out, and nobody supported Barzani in this. In fact, the PUK, the other political party that was not in power, weren't keen on it either. They thought, no, this may be a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't do this. But, they're Kurds, and so, they didn't publicly oppose it at all, and they went and vote for it. In fact, September 25th, Barzani's referendum for independence. Of course, 90% of the Kurds voted for it. The other thing he did that infuriated the Baghdad government was that he included the disputed territories in the vote, like assuming they're already part of our new Kurdistan. And the Iraqi government was like, no, we never resolved that. You militarily took it, but doesn't mean you have it. And so it infuriated the Iraqis. So then what happens? But by the way, just to fill in a few, other sort of levels of what's going on, the KRG signs a 20-year oil deal with Russia. Baghdad's furious. It all should have gone through us anyway. And then, as you see, just last July, Mosul retaken. September is the referendum. The middle of October, the Iraqi military march up, take Kirkuk, where all the oil is, push the Kurds out. But it was mostly the PUK Kurd Peshmerga that were supposed to defend it. And since they had never been very supportive of what Barzani decided to do without consulting them, they didn't have their heart in the fight and ended up just getting out of it and letting the Baghdad army take it. Baghdad army and the Popular Mobilization Forces, which the Iraqi parliament had passed a law, said we got to put the Popular Mobilization Forces inside our army and our structure. And they passed legislation to do that. Well, good luck on that. You know how that goes. You pass legislation. If nobody cooperates, it doesn't necessarily mean all of a sudden the Iraqi government has total control of the Popular Mobilization Forces. I'm almost done, Ty, so don't. Okay. Anyway, as a result of it, the Iraqi military closed down Turkish airspace, a huge punitive measure, because here you have Kurdistan that is prosperous and stable, and these two main airports in Erbil and Suleymaniye, flights coming in all the time. They are now housing 500,000 Syrian and Iraqi refugees. And, you have to have flights coming in and managing commerce and supporting those refugee encampments and all the rest of it. They close the airspace. And then they take Kirkuk, and then they go and take over the borders. The Kurdistan has always managed its own borders. And so that's where we are. France, the U.S., everybody calling for dialogue. We were scared to death. Some of our leading diplomatic voices said we didn't see it coming. We didn't think the Iraqi government would do that. They know of the support the U.S. and European governments have for the Kurds. Nobody thought they would do it. Well, they did it, and they took it. And the Kurds were no match. This Iraqi army, by the way, with the PMFs, Popular Mobilization Forces, had become very good in 3 years of fighting ISIS. And the small Peshmerga were no. Anyway, so they took it all back. And I want to tell you, the Kurds were devastated. I talked to people that are my colleagues over there, and people were stunned. They lost so much. They had this, what other Kurds in the other countries would have dreamed of, a semi-autonomous region, their own government, their own parliament. They controlled their borders. They had their own commerce. They had it all, and they lost it all overnight when the Iraqi government went in and took it all back. And We were scared that there would be a military conflict between two of our allies. Europe, the same. So you immediately saw Macron of France, May in Britain, Germany, everybody getting into the act and saying, flying down there and talking to a body who is the head of the Baghdad Iraqi government, saying, negotiate with them, dialogue with the Kurds, work this out, because you're paralyzing the Kurds up in the north. No air flights coming in whatsoever. They also passed a new budget where they cut the amount they were committed to giving the Kurds, a huge amount. So a lot of the Western voices and leaders in the West have really gone to bat for the Kurds. But, you know, the Iraqi government is also our ally. We want unity in Iraq. We don't want it broken up. We've had a long policy, a one Iraq policy, and we don't want to see it broken up. So we were never supportive. We said to the Kurds, don't do that referendum. We can't support it. They did it anyway, and it's cost them. So many people were just devastated, almost in tears. How could we have lost this that we worked all these decades to gain? So anyway, just to leave you with a few final thoughts, big setback for the Iraqi Kurds. We'll see what happens. There's everyday pressure for dialogue on a body, but listen, the Iraqi central government, Baghdad, feels like, look, they acted unilaterally to go up there and take Kirkuk. They established these oil deals, promising us they'd send us some of the revenue, and they were pretty mad at them. So there's a sort of revenge factor. We should rush up there and give them everything back? No, I don't think so. A lot of the world leaders in the West are pushing very hard on them to do it because it's crippled Iraqi Kurdistan right now. A couple of other points, whether or not the bottom line is no other nation was willing to violate its relationship with the Baghdad central government in defense of the Kurds. So the Kurds overplayed their hand. They thought they had, those friendships were deeper and that people would go to bat for them. Nobody's going to do that. It didn't happen, and the big question is now, can this Shia government bring Iraq with all its, it's part of the mosaic of the Middle East is all these ethnic and sectarian groups, and believe me, there are very many. I want to say two final things. One is sectarianization, that there's this feeling that goes around, it's sort of a quick and easy, they'll always be fighting the Shia and the Sunni. They started it way back in the 7th century, they'll be enemies forever. But no, here's what happens. Leaders take advantage of people's sense of identity to their own advantage. So you see this identity politics. We're talking about a lot today in our own country, across Europe as well. There have been times in history for years and years and years, the Shia and the Sunni live side by side, they get along, they intermarry, and then a leader comes along and there's some political advantage of calling out their differences and saying we never could trust those guys anyway, they're part of that other religious sect, etc. And the final point I want to make, and I think that's, by the way, a really important takeaway, is that's happening across the world. And you look in Europe with refugees, people, leaders trying to take advantage of ethnic differences. It's us versus them. They're the others, bad guys. And so the politics, these groups get played, and their divisions deliberately inflamed for somebody's political advantage. And finally, division creates weakness. That's what happened with the Kurds. That fatal division between the PUK and the KDP has some lessons for America today as well. I'm a little over, I apologize. Thank you very much.
Skip will be picking up questions, so Skip will be picking up some questions. We're going to have a ton of them. My gosh, Dr. Derby, thank you for that. Everything's so clear now in that area of the world.
Do you want me to use that? Yeah, I'll flip that one off.
A personal thing, back in 1958, 4 of us graduated from high school at 18 years, and we're going to go around the world. We got to Europe, worked our way over in a cargo ship, and managed to buy an old car, drove it through the former Yugoslavia on our way to go around the world, trying to get to India. We got to Istanbul, went to the consulate to pick up some mail, and the consular officer said, "You're not going anywhere further." well, we said we're going to India through Iraq and Iran. They said, no, there's been a coup in Iraq, and the king is overthrown, and something called the Ba'athist Party came in and took over. We were like, what the hell's the Ba'athist Party? But we had to turn around. Jill, a lot of questions that are coming up there. You didn't mention the Russian involvement much. I mean, we didn't want to complicate it anymore, but Moscow is making forays into this region. How are they playing the Kurdish situation?
Well, you just saw this oil pipeline. I mean, let me say one of the underlying tensions to the region is Iran sees the opportunity now with its strong alliance and support in Iraq. And then, given that Iran supported Bashar al-Assad over in Syria in the civil war, he was behind President Assad. Remember that Iran's been right in the middle of that. Russia as well, allied with Russia. And then over in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militia group and a political party in Lebanon. This idea of a Shia crescent going all the way from Tehran, the capital of Iran, clear over to Beirut is an underlying source of great tension. And I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but the Saudi crown prince is right in the middle of that and trying very hard to disrupt that, not let that happen. Iran has been greatly empowered by our invasion and the consequent Shia government that's in Iraq, and it has very close tie with them. So now, if they are, through their alliance with Assad, who is, by the way, belongs to a Shia minority sect, and then they can really sort of consolidate their power all the way from Tehran to Beirut. That's a fact that's going on in the crown. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salah is really trying to disrupt that. You know, he called in the prime minister from Beirut and suggested kindly that he resign, which he did, standing there in Saudi Arabia, and then gets back to Beirut and changes his mind. And then a very interesting thing, and that I just have to throw this in because I didn't get it, a very interesting development is Muqtada al-Sadr, who is a very powerful and influential Shia cleric in Iraq. And back when the U.S. had occupied Iraq, it was his Mahdi army. He has a huge following, this Muqtada al-Sadr, that worked hard to push the U.S. out. I mean, those IEDs and all the rest of it, they fought against the U.S. occupation of Iraq, okay? He's had such a change of heart. He's a great nationalist, and he's fighting against the Iranian influence in Iraq. And he went and sat down with the Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed, who's a Sunni. Now, you understand, Muqtada is a very strong Shia cleric. They got together, and they're working together to push the Iranian influence out of Iraq. Do you see the cross-cutting you get?
So the Shia is not a unified entity?
It's not. It's not. And, so I think there's some encouraging signs, I want to say, that not everybody in Iraq, some of those folks in the PF, and he's called for the disbanding of the Popular Mobilization Forces. And a body is saying, no, we're not going to disband them.
In Kurdistan?
In Kurdistan.
But the Russian influence, who are the Russians trying
Well, they're just trying to be influential, aren't they? I mean, they've aligned with Assad, so now they're playing a very, very powerful role there.
In Syria.
And they're striking deals. They struck that oil deal, very big oil deal with the Kurds. So they're trying to play that hand, but they're not going to alienate Baghdad either. They're just trying to gain influence wherever they can.
Yes. You keep talking about the Kurds. Well,
okay.
If you're from Russia, who do you go negotiate with? There is no Kurdish capital. There is no dominant.
No, I mean, you can't. I mean, they're four different groups, aren't they? And the Kurds of Iran have never had much opportunity. They've been suppressed. They're up there. Then the Kurds in Syria, lately seeing their opportunity to have something. You see, the Kurds in Iraq got their own government. Nobody else did.
So is that the entity that people deal with?
Yes, yeah.
The Kurdistan part of.
Yeah, except maybe the difference would be over in Syria. The Russians would be opposing the Kurds that are fighting the Syrian government. I mean, you make alliances wherever you can get them, and they're big playing big time in Syria. They've aligned with Assad. The Kurds are against Assad in that civil war, the Syrian Kurds, and so the Russians would be against them. So, there's a lot of cross-cutting alliances. The Russians are opportunists, and they're looking for friends wherever they find them.
This thing called Kurdistan, as it exists today, is only in Iraq?
That's right, because it's they have their own government. They were designated clear back in 1970, and we enforced it in our no-fly zone, the semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan. They have their own government, prime minister, parliament, and structure, and 2 political parties, and a third one that's recently emerged. So there, when you talk about Kurdistan, that's the only Kurdistan there is. Other than that, in Iran...
The Kurdistan in Iraq.
Yeah, because in Iran, they're a Kurdish minority. Over in Turkey, they're a Kurdish minority.
What percentage of the Turkish territory is Turkish?
About 20% maybe.
20% is Kurdish?
I'd say 20% of Turkey is Kurdish. And you saw on the graphic that they have a big chunk of space over there where there are probably maybe 15 to 18, 20 million Kurds live in eastern, southeastern Turkey.
It doesn't get complicated with Turkey being a NATO ally of the U.S.?
Well, it's always complicated, isn't it? I mean,
but
no. If you look at who's fighting with who against whom over in that region, you just see everybody's looking for their own interests and makes allies where they see they can make some advances. I mean, there's sort of no permanent friends here. But look at the Shia cleric who now is talking to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Who would have thought? And so, there's a lot of that happening. The Russians are tremendous opportunists. And as we have pulled back in our role in the Middle East, frankly, and continue to, they see a vacuum, and they're rushing in wherever they can. They played their hand in Syria and supported that brutal dictator Assad, who killed so many of his own people.
This is Moscow.
Moscow.
And Jill, U.S. policy, I'm not quite sure over the years what we have supported. Have we supported a united Kurdistan or just a partial Kurdistan?
Partial. Yeah, we've been very...
We couldn't advocate for the Kurdish region of Turkey to be part of a Kurdish nation, could we?
No, and we wouldn't do that, and I'll tell you why. We have had, for instance, a one Iraq policy. We don't want to see Iraq divided. We don't want to see an independent Kurdistan.
We don't want to see an independent Kurdistan?
No.
That's U.S. policy?
That's exactly right.
Which is say, Kurds, you get along in whatever country you happen to live in, Iraq, Turkey, Syria.
Well, we're mostly, what I want to say is the only place where there's really a Kurdish government is in northern Iraq, okay? We see them as our great allies, but when came a choice between supporting Baghdad and the Kurds in this referendum a couple of months ago, we went with Baghdad. We have a one Iraq policy. We don't want to see it broken up. We think a unified Iraq that works out its diversity and has a government that can bring everybody in is the best solution for a more stable region.
And this Iraq government that we're supporting is Shia or Sunni?
It's Shia. No, the majority. They elected the Shia when we invaded and took out Saddam Hussein and helped them draft a constitution, a democratic constitution in 2005. They got to elect whoever they wanted. Well, 65% of them are Shia in Iraq, and they voted for the dominant Shia party, and they've had that government ever since 2005. First Maliki, who we helped push out, but so did they, and now Abadi.
And we're supporting.
We support him, absolutely.
We've talked a lot about the Kurds in Turkey, Syria, Iran. Former Soviet Union Caucasus, Armenia, are there Kurds up in...
There are a few, but an awful lot of Kurds, particularly when we did the no-fly zone and Kurds had a chance to return to northern Iraq, and they saw the opportunity to live in a free, sort of a government of their own, even though it was part of a federal system in Iraq. A lot of them moved there. So there are some, but they wouldn't count as any kind of a powerful political faction.
So the divisions in Armenia aren't related to a Kurdish minority, or are they?
Well, what do I want to say? I mean, there's a similarity, isn't it? Here's an ethnic group with a common language language and culture and so on and so forth, that fought for its own space and was part of Turkey. And then that whole, the Turkish government doesn't call it a genocide, but they drove the Armenians out because they wanted unity.
This was 1922.
This is, the World War, and they thought the Armenians had been sympathetic to the Russians, and to get even, they drove them out, and on a hopeless march, 1 million died, leaving, forced out of Turkey. So, the Armenians have come together now, pulled themselves together, and have their own region and government, but, so there's some real similarities.
This was not a Kurdish issue.
This is not a Kurdish issue at all.
Internally, we have a couple questions here about the two main factions. Can you tell us first who the Peshmerga are? And
well, who
are the good guys?
Okay, here we go. see, this is where Americans falter. We are used to our cowboy movies, white hats, black hats, and we want it to be that way. Listen, it's not that way. It's a gray world. So guess what happened after the Kurds had their civil war? Now we're talking in Iraq, where they have this autonomous region. We protected them and so forth. So in resolving the civil war in 1998, they ended up with each having their own Peshmerga. So there's KDP, Barzani Peshmerga, Talabani Peshmerga.
Oh, they both have their...
They still have their own. Now, it sort of would be like the Republicans and the Democrats each having their own militia. So you sort of get...
So the Peshmerga doesn't belong to one faction only?
No, they don't. So there really are two Peshmerga, and you travel in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan, and you can see the little difference in the uniforms. Now, they are part of the Iraqi Kurdistan Defense Force, but they're affiliated with those two primary political parties. So Barzani, when he called for the referendum and the PUK are defending Kirkuk, they were like, well, wait a minute.
Now,
and didn't.
You mentioned all the outside powers, Turkey being the most important to us, but Iran certainly has no love for any Kurdish autonomy.
No.
Nor does this thing called Iraq.
No.
This thing called Iraq, somebody wrote here, is pretty artificial, isn't it?
Well, it goes back to 1918. So when we drew all those boundaries, but then, so is Jordan, so is Lebanon, so is Israel, so is Palestine, so is, the rest of them. Because you see, before that it was one big territory. And then the French and the British got out the map and did this.
All part of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In Byzantium.
Yeah.
You mentioned Israel. Question came up. You didn't say anything about... Does Israel care? Or do they get involved in this?
Only that they were nobody supported the idea, Barzani's idea of an Iraqi independence referendum. Nobody.
Nobody?
Except Israel. But they don't have a dog in the fight, and the more instability there is over there, the safer their region is. So, if you look at what was their motivation, Israel's in saying, well, we support you, but nobody else in the world supported Barzani because we don't want this area destabilized further. And nobody in the neighborhood of Iraqi Kurdistan, that means Iran there, that means Turkey there, that means Syria there, nobody with a Kurdish population wants to see an independent Kurdistan. It will destabilize them totally. The Turkish Kurds will say, well, look, Iraq gave them independence. We deserve it. Iran, Syria.
Not too many Kurds in Israel.
There are probably a few, but I think not very many.
There are successful examples of minorities. One person here mentioned the Basque region of Spain. Is that a model that maybe could be implemented?
Well, really, the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq was a great model. And the other Kurds in Iran, over in Turkey and Syria would have died to have that arrangement because they were running their own affairs. Really, they were running their own affairs. What's happened now that is just crushing to them is that the Iraqi army went up and took over their borders. They closed down their airports. It's really just paralyzed them. So before that, they ran their own affairs. I fly into Sulaymaniyah. They had the visa thing is real simple. You just fly through. You get your 10-day visa, whatever.
From the Iraqi government.
Well, ultimately, yeah, because it's sort of like California being a state inside of the federal government. You know, such was Iraqi Kurdistan, an autonomous region, a state, if you will, a province, whatever you want to call it, inside a federated Iraq. So ultimately, the Iraqi government has it, but they just given it all to the Kurds. They just don't want to worry about it. You take care of all that immigration stuff up there. People flying in want to do business with the Kurds and the KRG. So, I mean, they've run their own affairs quite independently with a lot of support from us and the West, and it's been ideal, and they lost it all in this referendum.
And we opposed the referendum.
We absolutely opposed. We went to Barzani, we said, pull it, don't do it. We put all the pressure we could, and he did it anyway, and that's what happened.
You know, the question, is there coherence in the U.S. State Department right now with respect to, well, overall, I guess, but particularly with, is there somebody there working on this?
Well, you worry about it because the State Department, which is our body of diplomats who are area specialists, that's our State Department, and they handle diplomacy. And you know, so many of our military leaders have said, without diplomacy, all you got are the guns, and it's no way to manage yourself in the world. And the State Department has really been decimated under this administration, and we worry a lot about it. One has to wonder, when we invaded Iraq, that people in the State Department who know that area must have known the consequences. Wait a minute. Do you really want to shift that Sunni-Shia balance over there? It's going to change that whole region. But I don't think anybody was listening that decided that taking out Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi invasion was the right thing to do. So, I mean, I worry a lot about it because I'm a great believer in diplomacy, and it can solve a lot of problems. We're working hard, I say, every day. Not so much us as a leader. I'm sad about this. It's the Europeans that are flying. It's the European leaders that are flying down into the Kurdish region, into Erbil, into Baghdad, and really putting a lot of pressure. And listen, we can all put a lot of pressure. We're all providing aid. Germany, $30 million to help with reconstruction. The French, 25. We're putting all that pressure on, saying, you sit down and talk to the Kurds and give them back. Work out some co-administrative arrangement around Kirkuk and the oil. The Kurds up there lost 50% of their income when they lost Kirkuk.
Yeah. This is a question for you in a future assignment we're going to get. I recall the signs a few years ago when Jill Derby for Congress. You going to run for Congress again?
I'm not running for Congress. I, am supporting candidates and I talk to them about the Middle East and always plead with us to be smart about our policy, because really, if you look back, clear back to when we appointed we appointed the Shah in Iran, and all the way down, you look at every time we seem to have caused unintended consequences that have so destabilized that region against our very interests. So I just plead with people to don't play the politics as much as learn the region, learn the history, listen to the people there that can tell you what some of the unintended consequences are of our bold military maneuvers that go clear back to what we did with Iran and the Shah, and then, invading Iraq, and then you go down through the list.
Well, what we're going to do as a final question, Jill, you're appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, working the Bureau of Mideast Affairs, and they said you will devise a rational three-part policy for the U.S. to deal with this Kurdish and Kurdistan issue. What are the three main tenets that you would want to see the U.S. do?
Well, listen, I just want to say to you, if you have any influence, I'd love that appointment. I imagine somebody was going to ask me, what should we do? And I thought a lot about it, and I thought, I don't know is the honest answer. But the truth is, what's going on now is very positive. in that although we've lost an awful lot of influence, and I could talk about that and my deep regrets about it, but we are where we are, aren't we? But really, if you read the local press, and you know what's going on every day, there's the Western powers are pressing hard on a body in the Iraqi central government to go talk to the Kurds and work this out, because we don't want this one more destabilizing influence. They're both our allies, good guys. So what we're doing...
Who's both our allies?
Well, both the Kurds and the Iraqi government. The Kurds,
as well as Turkey.
Turkey's an ally, absolutely. Yeah, that's why we wouldn't support the Kurds in the face of Baghdad's unity that we continue to support, one Iraq, okay? So what we're doing is really diplomacy, and I think that's what we have to continue. We're up against it, aren't we? Assad won that civil war. Russia's a much bigger player in there than they ever were before. I think I'm for asserting our influence there in all the diplomatic ways we can. We have a lot of levers. We give a lot of aid.
Can we bring the fighting elements together?
Well, we will rely on the Iraqi central government to do that, but we have some allies there. So there are plenty of people inside Iraq that want to keep Iraq intact, that want everybody to get along, but like the United States and every other country, there are different political forces that pull and tug, okay? So I think we support the forces that are trying, like Abadi is trying to do this, but he's got Maliki that was the last, okay, very Shia over there running some militias. It's a very difficult situation, but I think we continue to apply pressure where we can, support al-Sadr now, who's working with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia to push the Iranians out. So there are I mean, without marching in with our guns blazing, there's lots that we can do working with people that are sympathetic, pulling in allies to try to bring more peace to the region. And I know that's not 3 points, but I mean, I think you could break that down into, okay, what do we do with Saudi Arabia, who has funded most of the rise of ISIS, and you know that, fundamentalist Islam and so on and so forth. Yet, what do we do about this Iranian-Saudi split? And I just think we keep playing the key players in it to try to avoid a war, which would be catastrophic in that area, honestly. So I think that it's hard to break that down into 3. I could look at the different areas, what we need to do here, here, and here. But generally, I think we need to bulk up our State Department with the experts in the area that really understand the dynamics, because you heard it. There are cross-cutting loyalties everywhere. And then, smart, soft power, bringing allies along is the best approach.
And Jill Derby, you're doing your part by serving on the American University in Kurdistan and Soleimani. We want to thank you greatly for bringing some clarity to a very murky situation. Dr. Derby, thank you.